morning, guys. Let me tell you, spring has sprung. It has been an entire month of beautiful weather and flowers and pollen, and my allergies are just torture for me. What are allergies? What is this thing with I'm allergic to pollen? What does that mean? Well, pollen is something that's floating through the air, comes from these trees, from these flowers, and the allergies is my immune system saying, there's something wrong with that. That's dangerous. I'm going to try and get rid of it. So watery eyes, it's trying to flush that pollen away from you. Having you sneeze, it's trying to send that pollen away from you. Extra mucus, it's trying to get rid of that pollen out of your body. Your immune system is working really hard, even though it doesn't realize the pollen is probably not going to harm you. Allergies are strange. But what is this pollen? Let's talk about pollen today. So plants make pollen. Every plant wants to reproduce, just like my tomato plant that I've got right here. And if it wants to reproduce, it needs to make two things. It needs to make sperm and it needs to make an egg. And those two things need to come together to bring the genes that would make that new plant. Right in here are the new blooms. These are going to be flowers, and inside them, right now it's building the parts of a flower that will include pollen, and it will include the things that make eggs. The pollen is from the male part of the plant. The pollen is what produces the sperm, and the ovule is from the female part of the plant, and that's what produces the eggs. 125 million years ago, we had the first plants with flowers. We call these angiosperms. They were fertilized by beetles crawling around, collecting some of that pollen, eating some of that pollen, and carrying it over to another plant, another flower, and pollinating it, creating that connection between the eggs and the sperm. Let's take a look at a flower and figure out exactly what's in it and what all the parts are. The first part of the flower that you're already familiar with is the petal. The first part of the flower that you're already familiar with is the flower petals. These are the brightly colored, soft, leaf-like structures that are around the outer edges of the flower, and this is what attracts pollinators. They attract other organisms that are going to help identify that this is something to get pollen from. The next part of the flower is the sepals. These are the harder green outer parts that surround the petals, and these ones are important in protecting the flower from something that might want to come up and attack it. These are especially important when the flower is still in its bud stage and it's immature and it's not ready to bloom yet. It's protecting it. The sepals are surrounding it like a little capsule to protect the flower before it blooms. The stalk that supports the flower, this is called the pedicel. The pedicel is the stalk that supports that single flower. And then the receptacle is like the cup-like structure at the bottom of here that is the whole area from the sepal to the pedicel that is holding the base of the flower. We open up the flower, we can see a little bit more of what's inside. Now, first thing I want you to look at is this. This right here is the male part of the flower. This is called the stamen. And the stamen consists of a long, thin filament topped with an anther. An anther I like to think of like an antler, like on top of a deer's head. But this anther is the part that has the pollen. The anther makes the pollen, and the pollen is very important because that's where the plant sperm is. Now, to see the female part of the flower, we're going to take off the petals. We're going to take off the anthers. And what's left, this long skinny thing that looks like one of the stamens, is actually the female part of the flower called a pistil. And the pistil has a sticky part up here at the top called the stigma. It's called the sticky stigma. This is sticky so it can hold on to any pollen that it touches. It has a shaft called the style. This long skinny part here is called the style. And an ovary down here at the bottom that encloses small structures called ovules. So right in here are the ovules. And the ovules are very important because that's where the eggs are made. Male sperm cells are contained within the pollen grains. You can pick up some pollen yourself if you put your finger inside one of these flowers and you pull off some of these colored grains of pollen. After a pollen grain moves from the anther to the stigma, then the pollen tube grows down through the style to connect with the ovary. And once that tube, that transport tube is built, then the sperm travel from the pollen up here all the way down to the ovules down here, and they connect with the eggs and they fertilize those eggs. At that point, the petals naturally fall off of the flower and the ovary grows a protective layer over the outside of it. So this lemon I just pulled off the tree was actually a flower at one time, and the part of the flower that this was the ovary. Now we can cut it open. What do you think we're going to find? Down here would have been the pedicel, and then here is the entire ovary, which has gotten larger. But within this ovary, we have the seeds. The seeds are the fertilized eggs that have grown, and they are ready to become new plants. But why would they have new plants trapped inside this delicious yellow substance? Why do plants make fruit? Animals that eat the fruit will spread the seeds so that all the plants aren't growing in the same spot. If they all grew in the same spot, that would decrease their chance of survival. If they're eaten by an animal and the animal takes it somewhere else, then it's planted away from the first tree, and then it has a better chance to survive. It's also going to be surrounded by poop when it is planted, because the plant will come from where the animal pooped. Spreading it and planting it with poop is two ways that the plant is making sure it has a better chance of survival. Plants use sunlight to create sugar. We know that. They collect carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, put them together, they make glucose. Flowering plants use some of this sugar to create nectar. Now, this nectar has another purpose by attracting another organism. It attracts insects and birds and pollinators. These are pollinators, things that will come to get either the pollen, to eat the pollen, or the nectar. Some insects will eat the pollen and the nectar. Some of them will just eat the nectar. Some of them will just eat the pollen. But either way, when the insect comes to the flower, it gets a little bit of that pollen on its body, and when it flies off to another flower, it brings some of that pollen and attaches that pollen accidentally, to the sticky stigma. So let's go through 3 main points of this video. Number 1, why do plants create pollen? Plants create pollen because they need sperm to fertilize their eggs to make new plants. Why do plants create fruit? To protect the seeds so that when an animal eats it, it is spread far to be planted and fertilized. Why do plants make nectar? Well, some plants create nectar with their pollen to further attract extra pollinators that would come for the nectar and pick up some of the pollen and spread it to another plant. That's it for today, guys. Have a good day, stay safe, stay healthy, and take a look at some flowers if you get a chance.